Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Hey. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise today to speak to C8 at report stage here. C8's been a bit of a baby of our side over here, and I actually helped shepherd this through when it first got introduced to the House, and we actually looked at it in committee where I was, in the Finance Committee, for some time. It was an interesting bill. We had a number of proposals brought forward at committee to try and make it a better bill, and we're still trying to make it a better bill. But one of the issues, of course, we've been focusing on, and I think this government's finally started to try and focus on, although I don't really think they know what they're doing, is housing. And I say that with some concern for our country going forward here, because I don't think this government really has their eye on the ball with housing. I think they've missed the mark for 7 long years. And you take a look at housing in Canada 7 years ago, you take a look at housing now, the demographics have changed. We are more and more of an investing country for real estate as opposed to a living country for real estate. And that's because we've lost everything else we invest in this country. So if you were a Canadian and you were saying, okay, I need to put my money safely into an investment that's going to return 15% a year, and your financial advisor said, there is one commodity under this broken government where you get 15% a year. It's the only thing happening in the Canadian economy of any extent right now is residential housing. Everything else has fallen off the wayside. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, combined investment in the Canadian economy has gone negative. That means depreciation of our assets in Canada, our capital stock, we say, our farms, our factories, our buildings, is negative. They depreciate more than money that's been invested in Canada over the past number of years. That's a problem, because we do need long-term sustainability, and it's the first time in our history where we've experienced this. And the government has to start paying attention to that, because they've been ignoring too much as far as our economy goes. Part of the reason for that is, of course, regulations that have stopped investment in this country, regulations that have stymied the development of our best industries in Canada with no clear thought about the outcome of what happens there. But I'm going to get back to housing here, because housing is what I really want to talk about. In this bill, there was a 1% surtax on passively held non-resident owners of real estate. Now, this is a trap, I'm going to tell the government right now, and what Canadian people need to understand is this is a way for the federal government to find their way into taxing what should be a municipal taxation mechanism, and that is a tax on property. Right now, there's already a tax on property, and everybody here that owns a home knows that tax. You pay it once a year, and you pay it in June. In my province, you pay it at the end of June. It is your municipal taxes. Those municipal taxes is based on the value of your property, and it has an escalation in some provinces. In BC particularly, they've started escalating that based on non-resident owners, and in some cases it's as much as 6% higher in British Columbia. Regardless of that application of an extra 5% plus 1% plus 2%, however it happens in Vancouver, in different parts of the Lower Mainland, 7.7% of the housing stock in the Lower Mainland is still owned by foreign investors. Not that's a bad thing, except in some cases here that I'll go into later in my speech. I think Canada should be a country that does accept foreign investment. I wish that foreign investment coming into Canada was going into productive uses in our economy. Housing is a passive investment, and I don't think the government understands any of that. This is part of the problem we have. They've been schizophrenic now, because now we've got a budget in front of the House of Commons. In addition to this measure taken in Bill C8, we've got a budget that actually says, okay, we're going to stop foreign buying for 2 years now. Now, okay, we're going to put a little foot on the brake while you figure this out. And this is what the government is saying at this point in time. Interestingly, this was part of the Conservative platform in the election. Now, I take pride in that, because we've identified foreign interference in the Canadian housing market as the one issue, first and foremost, that we need to adjust in order to get back to a level playing field about where Canadians can actually buy the houses and the condos they live in. Identified by the Conservatives in the election, and I'm glad that finally the Liberals, after 7 years, have figured out what to happen here, how to actually move this lever forward. But think about that. In C8, you've got a 1% surtax, and then The government's saying, well, okay, we'll also stop this for 2 years. So they're only figuring this out, and I'm going to suggest as well that they're not getting good advice in this file. Now, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation is the crown corporation of this government, and I would say that in the last 7 years, its nonpartisanship has been diminished to the point where it is just an instrument of the Liberal Party of Canada, and that's a shame. That's an absolute shame. I look at what's happening here around the world, and I see this group of people that are continuing to put more money in their own pockets with huge bonuses, but what outcome? In most parts of Canada, when you get a bonus, it's based on the fact you did your job very well. The bonuses being received by our public officials in this case are being received because they're ruining the Canadian housing economy for Canadians. And how are they doing that? Well, they're coming up with all kinds of programs, none of which are working. All of which are kind of throwing words against the wall that have no real outcome for Canadians. Now, I'm going to suggest perhaps we need new leadership, perhaps we need a new minister. Because this minister, I think he disclosed earlier this week, and permit me to be, I'm reporting what I heard on the news, is that he's also invested just recently in the Canadian housing market. And that's good. He's got a financial advisor that says there's nothing else to invest in Canada, so go into housing. But I think that that's part of the problem here, and maybe those people advising him to do that are at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I don't think he would invest in housing if he's going to see a correction here on the horizon, which is really, we need a slowdown in the escalation of housing prices in Canada, Mr. Speaker. That is what this country requires in order to get back to a basis where new families, new Canadians can afford to buy a home and live here. Now, part of the problem we have in the Canadian housing market, of course, is the foreign influence money laundering. And I'm going to go through a bit of money laundering here with you, Mr. Speaker. Money laundering is an amount that is between $14 billion and $43 to $113 billion is laundered in Canada each year and contributes to domestic problems such as higher house prices and fentanyl. So if I had to, and I knocked doors in Calgary Centre 2 elections now, 2019 and 2021. The amount of homeless people, the amount of people dying of fentanyl, the amount of drug addiction in my riding, downtown Calgary, has grown exponentially. And part of that is a link to foreign money that is coming in that is bad foreign money. There's good foreign money coming in to invest. There's also laundered foreign money that's just looking for a home for the proceeds of crime. And that's what we need to combat here in Canada more than anything else. And that's the main issue where this government has failed. We've always said, I've always said, that the number one thing we can do is address the money laundering laws in Canada to stop this from happening any further. Now, $43 to $113 billion, big gap because it's an estimation, but a bunch of that is going into investments that are safe as houses. And I've called on this minister, I've called on this government to stop that trade. The actual Minister of Finance says, well, we'll look at, doing this in 2025. And I'm curious why, if you know there's a problem, if you know we're the worst perpetrator of money laundering in the G7, why you're going to wait another 3 years before you decide to look at it. And I'm going to suggest that there might be some link there. Is it a long-term exit where you get to a whole bunch of buyers that are coming in here, laundering money in Canada, associated with people you know? I'm going to suggest that maybe there is no impetus on the other side of the House to actually reduce the prices of houses for Canadians across Canada. This is a travesty. Take the first step first and actually get towards a base of housing investment in Canada that makes sense. Now, in the budget, the government came up with this crazy idea, pardon me, of actually building a whole bunch more houses in Canada. Well, we have lots of houses in Canada. Actually, as a percentage of our economy, it's actually more than any other sector at this point in time. And by throwing more money at the wall, we are actually going to further inflate the cost of houses because there's not enough trades out there to do it, and there's not enough money out there to do it. There's not enough lumber out there to do it. Think about all that's going to go up in this process. Like I say, this is a crazy approach from a government that is only trying to find its feet. It doesn't have good advisors on housing. It doesn't have good policy in housing. It needs to set itself back and say this is a major problem in Canada, particularly for young Canadians, particularly for people buying their first homes, and get back to a basis where we start making sense in this country again. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions and commentaires? The honourable member from Winnipeg North.
Thank you. It's a bit much, Mr. Speaker, when you think about it, from the days of Stephen Harper, which completely ignored the housing industry as a whole, to a government that brought in the first national housing strategies, literally committing billions of dollars in low-income, non-profit housing, in supporting provinces and territories, in providing units, repairs, and so forth. In many ways, first-time home buyers program, we've recognized the value and the importance of housing, and at the end of the day, the federal government needs to play a leadership role, and it has been playing a leadership role. But my question to my friend is, would he not agree that in dealing with the housing shortage, because there is a shortage of housing stock, that the best way of dealing with that is, as much as we can play a leadership role, but municipalities and to a certain degree provinces also need to come on, because it is an issue of supply. Does he have any recommendations on how, what he believes, what we can do to increase the supply of housing?
The honourable member from Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague across the way there, and I really appreciate his admiration of Stephen Harper and his government's admiration of Stephen Harper's policies. Because the first-time home buyers program is a bit of a cop-off of the tax-free savings account, and that's a great savings instrument for Canadians, and I know that they copy that in order to try and have something called the first-time home buyers program, which would be great if you have money to put into another savings account while you're actually saving for a mortgage at the same time. So thank you for some actually constructive comment on that. Let's see how it works, but not the worst plan I've seen from the other side of the House. I have to give him that kind of credit. But there are other issues here, and in dealing with my friend's question, he actually talks about the supply of housing. The supply of housing in Canada is actually as high as it's ever been. The issue is the supply of money going into housing is also as high as it's ever been. 30% of the houses built in Canada now are owned by investors, like your fellow cabinet minister, the Minister of Housing, who just recently went into that as well. This is part of the problem. We now have everybody investing in housing because there's nowhere else to invest. I wish you'd heard that in my speech. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires? The honourable member de Jonquière.
Drummond.
Oh. Wrong, sorry.
Je félicite et remercie mon collègue pour son discours. Nous avons, au Bloc québécois, appuyé cette motion pour la deuxième lecture parce qu'il n'y avait tellement pas de substance, il y avait tellement de choses à améliorer, à essayer à tout le moins d'améliorer. Et de bonne foi, on est allé en faveur pour qu'on puisse travailler dessus. Mais finalement, il n'y a pas grand-chose qui s'est passé entre-temps. Alors, on se retrouve avec, encore une fois, un projet de loi en absence de substance. Et je voulais demander l'opinion de mon collègue quand on voit qu'il n'y a pas grand-chose qui répond à la pénurie de main-d'œuvre là-dedans. Il n'y a pas énormément de considération aussi pour le problème des chaînes d'approvisionnement. Bref, très peu et des problèmes criants. Alors, comment réagit mon collègue face à cette absence de solution réelle dans C8? Merci.
Honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Je remercie mon collègue de Jonquière. Jonquière? Excuse-moi. Drummond. Je m'excuse. Mais je suis bien d'accord avec ça. C'est un problème au Canada avec l'inflation dans l'économie maintenant. L'inflation est causée par la hausse des prix des autres choses, mais les pandémies a causé une partie de l'inflation, mais aussi l'approvisionnement de bois d'œuvre. Moi, ça monte beaucoup. Ça monte presque 4 fois pendant l'été dernier. Et ça, c'était un problème. Et ça va monter le coût d'une maison vraiment. Et il y a d'autres choses pendant la chaîne d'approvisionnement qui va monter le prix des maisons aussi. Mais merci.
Honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
It's nice to see you in the chair this afternoon. I would also like to thank my colleague from Calgary for his speech today. It was very, very interesting. And one of the things that he talked about is is fentanyl and how fentanyl is one of these things that is being used as a money laundering tool. And so I'm curious. I mean, we talked about housing, we talked about affordability, we talked about, he's brought up the issue of fentanyl. And as somebody who is deeply concerned about the poisoned drug supply in our communities, and someone who recognizes that housing is part of the solution for those who are suffering from the poison drug supply, that in fact the combination of mental health, housing, and a safe supply are actually part of the solutions. I'm wondering if he will be supporting my colleague from Courtney Alberni with his bill C-216 on safe supply, making sure there is safe supply for folks in Canada.
In 20 seconds or less, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, I thank my colleague very much for that question. And I remember reading an article from a well-known Canadian years ago that said, it doesn't matter the source of the money you bring into Canada. If it's dirty elsewhere, once it's in Canada, it'll be fine. That's completely absurd. Completely absurd. And it's a well-known Canadian that wrote that. When you're inviting dirty money into Canada, you're inviting everything that's associated with that dirty money, the drug pushing, the other crimes associated therewith. So making sure that that stays as isolated from Canada is part of our goals in getting more investment in Canada. And thank you very much for the question. I'm sorry I wasn't able to address it fully.
Resuming debates, the honourable member.